Yes, welcome back. Good to see you all again. Okay, thank you. Are you having a good time? I'm glad, because now it's going to be even better. If that's possible, of course. Okay. This session is about the exposure of corruption. It's about, there are plenty of chairs over here. Don't be shy. Exposure of corruption, the role of the media, and in particular the role of investigating journalism. Have you all had your tickets for the concert for tonight? This will be the last time I say it, I promise. But I will be there and I will check. So if you're not there tonight, yeah, you know what's going to happen tomorrow when we meet. No. Okay. I'm not going to say any more. I will leave the stage for a very special person. I've been looking very much forward to this session. Please give. Are you ready, Jess? A very warm welcome to the moderator of this session, Jess Search, CEO of Doc Society.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Hey. So I'm with Doc Society, and we are running the Films for Transparency program. And I've had the privilege over the last few years of working on many of the most impactful social impact films, including co-producing Citizen 4 with Laura Poitras that broke the Edward Snowden story. This afternoon, this session, which incorporates both a short film and a panel discussion, asks, how can anti-corruption campaigners continue to expose the truth in a time of increased media manipulation? How can journalists and whistleblowers make sure that their truths are heard and fake news is not believed? But first, how are you all? How are you? We're about halfway through this conference, and most of you have traveled far to be here. And we all know that attending a conference is time away from our teams, it's time away from our families. And so on behalf of Transparency International, I want to really thank you all for making the time to come here and be together. And now I want you to reach out to someone nearby, preferably someone you've never met, and look deeply into their eyes. And as you shake their hand, I want you to say, I mean it, I want you to say, thank you for being here. Okay, I'm going to tell you a story. So in February of this year, I received a phone call from Carol Cadwalla, the Guardian journalist working on the Cambridge Analytica story. And she said to me, I've got a whistleblower. Would you like to meet them and make a short film with them? And she gave me Chris Wiley's phone number. Meeting Chris has changed my life, because it made me realize that the nature of the challenges we face was both quantitatively and qualitatively different. And I'm still struggling to completely process these implications. So I'm happy that we have this session here today to help me do so. The first short film that we made was released by The Guardian on the day that Chris Wiley's revelations went public. and it was seen over 1.5 million times. But we carried on filming. And the 20-minute short film that you're about to see now is the result. The director, Mark Silver, has had feature documentaries at Sundance Film Festival before, and he's currently working with Amnesty International to understand and communicate the implications of these new data technologies for human rights. At the last plenary, which was excellent, I thought, in this room, Kumi Naidoo gave us the challenge that we need to reframe the narrative. And as you'll learn from this short film, to that end, he is in complete agreement with Steve Bannon. That who wins the cultural war controls the political sphere. And after the film, I'm going to invite up my expert panel to help me think through the risks and possible remedies as they apply to the countries in which they live and they work. Please roll the film. Thank you. Right, I'm now going to bring my panel up, and I'm going to ask you to welcome them once they're all up here as a group. But if I can have Sochu, who is an amazing Cambodian politician and rights activist, who was a member of parliament twice, most recently 2013, 2017. Can I have Cynthia, human rights advocate, come on up, come on. Cynthia, human rights advocate from Malaysia, executive director of the C4 Centre. C4 stands for Centre to Combat Corruption and Cronyism. Can I have Barbara, who's the exec director of the Vienna-based International Press Institute. Thomas is the executive director of Article 19 in London, focuses on defending freedom of expression and freedom of information. And Will, who's joining us from Washington, I've just learned that he's an Australian, who's a senior ICIJ reporter. And for those that don't know, that's the International Committee for Investigative Journalists. Do I have them all? Yeah, please give them a massive round of applause. You're in my seat. Yeah. Can you go on that one? Thanks. Thank you. Welcome all. So obviously the Cambridge Analytica story is just part of a picture of sort of disintegration of trust and confusion as we've seen our world changing and repivoting kind of post-Brexit and Trump and in many other countries around the world. So I know it's something that for all of you in your work and your personal lives that you've been kind of discussing and mulling over. And I want us just to start with, some thoughts from everyone on the panel about, the moment that we find ourselves in, the kind of the fake news moment we find ourselves in. Barbara.
Well, IPI is a network of editors and journalists dedicated, besides being dedicated to defending press freedom, also dedicated to...
Well, hang on a second. We're having a complaint about the angle of our panel. I wanted to make sure that we could all see each other in the eye as we were talking, but perhaps I curved the seats too much for those on the edge. Yes, they're nodding. Is that better? Not better? Yeah, yeah. But don't go too flat, because I want to make sure that you can all see each other in the eye line.
I'll lean in.
Happiness? Happiness? Fantastic. Barbara, please continue.
So the network looks at press freedom and quality journalism, independent journalism, and we've been around for 70 years, and for 70 years we have been dealing with propaganda. And so the reaction to fake news from the IPI network is the reaction that we have to any other type of propaganda. We see strong governments or state forces or powerful people behind, and using the tools of their times in order to ensure that people are convinced of a certain message. Then we can go more into the details about what is new here. But in fact, so that's a reaction to that. So how does the journalistic community react to that, or how has it reacted? It has reacted by strengthening what we are, strengthening the need for quality, strengthening also the need to explain to our audiences what is it that we're doing.
You're jumping a little head straight to kind of how we kind of respond to the situation. But I'm curious whether you're sort of saying, you know, same shit, different day. There's always been propaganda. You know, nothing new here. Is that the feeling of IPI, or do you feel like this is a kind of, you know, for me, I feel like this is a step change. Partly it's literally quantitative, like actually the amount that they're talking about, and partly for me it's a qualitative change because of the method of delivery. But are you feeling like journalists have always had to combat, you know, propaganda, and it's nothing new?
I do think that because of the methodology that has been adopted, because of the data set, because of what was just explained in the film, certainly the reach is immense. I also do think that there is a new element here, which is maybe not entirely present in the common propaganda that we used to know before, which is the element of distrust. So the lack of trust in the institutions that support our societies. So that element is new and is difficult to deal with. You know, it was much easier to deal with the type of propaganda like me, I'm your government, I'm your leader, you need to, I'm good. So that is a very straightforward. This is a complicated message. So it's much more difficult to counter, and it's much more dangerous because it basically revolves everything we have believed in. So in that sense, I agree. But it is still an information war, a disinformation war.
Yeah, and I feel like I'm going to go to the other sort of journalism representative on the panel first, Will from the ICIJ. I mean, it's true, isn't it, that we're seeing, you know, the trust in journalists dropping in a way that is really surprising, because I feel like in the previous eras where governments were perhaps a bit blunter with their propaganda, journalists were very much seen, had a very high standing because they were seen as being apart from that. And what's so insidious about this moment is that we're losing, do you know what I mean, that trust and traction. Is that something that you're aware of and worried about?
Oh, absolutely. I think we're now in a stage for lots of journalists where a document isn't even recognized as a document. If we take the example of the Panama Papers, for example, there you had 11.5 million files, of which no question remains about the authenticity of those documents. We literally had cases in which the passport of the daughter of a sitting prime minister appeared in those files. That daughter would take to Twitter, say, "It's not me, you journalists have got it wrong, you're making stuff up about me." And there's a, you know, if my jaw could drop, it would, and it would have been on the floor a long time ago. But there are real questions for journalists about how do we combat the fact that a fact is no longer a fact and a document is no longer a document, and remain journalists in what we do.
Cynthia, I see you nodding, and of course Cambridge Analytica was a part of the SCL group. Of course, we celebrated for about 5.5 seconds when they closed Cambridge Analytica, but second, number 6, we realized that, of course, it's meaningless because they just open up other companies, and SCL Group is still operating. And it was that company which was very active in Malaysia and in kind of working on Malaysian elections. So how was the Cambridge Analytica story received in your part of the world?
Yes. Well, Malaysia is very special, very unique, because the Cambridge Analytica actually invested very heavily in the elections prior to this one. So it was the chief minister of a particular state that engaged them. And he's the son of the current prime minister, by the way. And it was very successful in actually wresting the state from the people that were ruling that state government before. So no one knew about it until Channel 4 exposed the information. So similarly, I want to get into the 1MDB story, because that was something that was really very critical to exposing a massive corruption scandal that we would not have known about if not for the Wall Street Journal reporters and Sarawak Report, which is a blog based in the United Kingdom that had actually exposed this corruption scandal. So it is incredibly important that investigative journalists are actually able to do their work, and that in exposing this grand corruption scandal, the people in power, especially the former Prime Minister Najib, had used this whole fake news propaganda to confuse people, to say that whatever the Wall Street Journal exposed, Sarawak report exposed, was not really the real thing. But he had another explanation, which was the Arab donor, some unknown Arab donor that had actually given him the money. And
I love that. He came out and said, oh, no, sorry for the confusion. You mustn't think this is something untoward. This is simply a private donation from an Arab admirer, as if that explained, how much was it, like 100 million?
700 million
700
US
million,
dollars.
yeah, just a little gift from an admirer. Happens all the time.
So this fake news thing was being used by both sides. So both sides were trying to say, my version is correct, and that you're politicizing the whole thing. So guess what? They actually formulated an anti-fake news law. And 2 days before Parliament was dissolved, the anti-fake news law was passed in Parliament, and it was just rushed through. The whole process was rushed through. So it was legitimized, even though there was no real effort to actually prove who was actually speaking the truth.
And Mu, I mean, we exchanged some notes on this before you joined the panel, and again, you're very aware of the application of these kinds of technologies, in your part of the world. And I also just wanted to really point out as well that I feel like what Chris is talking about here is, well, actually it's a phrase that he uses, digital colonialism, and he talks a little bit about it, in the film, because this is not only that these are technologies and approaches that are affecting other countries in your region, but they're also being controlled, from London and from the States, which I think is also worth noting and particularly insidious. So is it something that you've been talking about these last few months, about what it means for you?
First of all, I would like to ask in the audience, how many of you are investigative journalists? Raise your hand.
Are journalists?
Journalists, yes. And in an oppressive country. Higher, raise your hand higher. I put my hat off to you. Because, you know what? We cannot live in the fake news, fake society. I want my children to grow up in a world, a society, where they can trust each other, where they can trust news. Yeah? I am on the side of the victim of fake news. I come from Cambodia. I'm one of the top leaders of the opposition in Cambodia. And the opposition in Cambodia was dissolved by Prime Minister Hun Sen, who has been Prime Minister in Cambodia for the past 35 years. So he won, and the opposition in Cambodia was winning the election, gaining 44% of the total votes in a fake election. But that's why we had to be dissolved. So, what does the Prime Minister of Cambodia does before he jumped into the past election, 2018? In 2016, he realized that the youth in Cambodia, 70% of our population are under the age of 35, are very active in social media, on Facebook particularly, and giving votes to the opposition. And then the Prime Minister of Cambodia, Mr. Hun Sen, from now on I call him Mr. Hun Sen, he jumped into Facebook in 2016. He only had about 3 million likes. By now, he has 10 million likes. Cambodia has a population of 15 million. How can Mr. Hun Sen have 10 million from click farms? He buys these likes. So, and then on top of that, he has dissolved all the independent media in Cambodia, that has been functioning for the past 20 so years. And on top of that, he has a huge machinery of what is called fresh news. Fresh news is fake news, my friends, in Cambodia. That's what we go about. So I don't want to live in that culture, in the society. You don't either. You know, when it's like that, you destroy democracy. There's no way. What we do at Position in Cambodia or anywhere in the world where we really are truly believing in democracy, and that's the only way to shape our culture, our society, give justice to those who do not know, who lost their land and lost their whatever in corruption. You want to rebuild your country believing in free, fair elections. But if the election is shaped like this, it totally destroys democracy. And that's why I'm here, and I'm glad I'm here, and I will speak very, very strongly about this type of fake news and corruption. You got to stop it, and we're here to stop it.
Bravo. And yes, give her a round of applause. And I feel like it used to be that, in Western Europe, we were able to kind of like flatter ourselves that we had these free and fair elections and, be part of movements to help such, elections happen in other countries. But the truth is that with things like the Brexit campaign, thousands and thousands of political adverts were served to Facebook, targeted in the way that Chris talks about, and we are never going to know what those adverts even said. I mean, we know what was on the side of the bus, and then we can have a public debate about it, but we're actually literally never going to know. So I feel like we're actually now at a place where, what we have in common in these elections is really coming together, and not in a good way. I'm going to bring Thomas in now from Article 19. We were having a pre-discussion as a panel, and you were speaking about how you can't look at this sort of fake news in isolation, that actually this is part of a kind of bigger picture, and something very much that Barbara was agreeing with, a bigger picture of the attacks on journalists. Do you want to kind of pick up on that?
I will, but can I answer, or can I speak to the point that was made there? Because I think we've had two really good examples of something which I consider to be essentially global north navel gazing, which has had a massive impact on two countries in the global south. The real problem with fake news is not, in my mind, the fake news itself. It's the response to the fake news, and it's broken broadly into two groups. You've got governments that are beginning to legislate on fake news, and personally I consider fake news a misnomer. There is no such thing as fake news. There's news of varying quality, varying professionalism. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. But if you have legislation, you empower government to decide what the legal obligation of truth is, who is right, who is wrong. It will be used instantly to shut down criticism. And the other danger that we face is that tech giants, who used to have the mantle of intermediary reliability, are now losing that. So essentially, they are being pressured by governments and other actors to censor different types of corporate censor different types of content, to change algorithms, and to put pressure, basically, on different types of online content, which is closing down the very news outlets, which are the essential lifeblood. The Sarawak report, if the anti-fake news bill had gone through in Malaysia, that would be the first site that the Malaysian government would have shut down after April if we hadn't had an election. So I think we've got to look very seriously at the impact and what is fake news. And some of the academic studies that have come out earlier this year actually give us a very different picture. Give us a picture in which there was a Reuters Institute one from University of Oxford. It basically concluded, I summarize greatly, but that the reach of fake news websites in Italy and France was 1% of the population, as compared to the main print dailies, which had about 25 and 50% respectively. The top 20 fake news websites in each of those countries didn't even come close to the top one mass media. And the same in the US there's a Exeter University, Dartmouth College publication that again also concludes that, okay, there was a large consumption of around, 1% for Clinton voters, 6% of fake news for Republicans. But actually, the real consumers of fake news in the election were already very conservative Republican voters. There was 10% of the Republican vote were the main consumers of fake news. Now, maybe that swung an election, I don't know. But the point being that I think the impact is being overstated, and I think it's being overstated, and the counter-reaction to that overstatement is having severe implications.
And were they looking at Facebook ads in that? Because I don't think they can have been, because Facebook haven't released that information, so we don't know what people were seeing as ads that were purporting to be news.
Yeah, no, they weren't. They were looking at articles and readership of articles.
Yeah, which I think is only one part of the, of the problem.
Well, I mean, if you define fake news as a type of product, as a type of article rather than a piece of advertising, I agree.
Yeah, because I think the fake news some of the content that we're bringing under this rubric of fake news is literally, you know, Elvis is alive and living on the moon, served to you as a Facebook ad. And that's not about whether that's news of varying quality. That's just like fake news.
But that, I mean, if that's an ad, it's an ad.
As far as I understand it, not having been to the moon myself personally.
My understanding, these studies were looking at articles which were being portrayed as news articles, not advertisement.
Got you. So I think that's one part of the problem, but doesn't cover this Facebook advertising, electioneering model where things are put forward as if they are news and they are not news, which is partly what Chris is talking about. But actually, I'm encouraged to hear that within the kind of more official news blogging sphere, that those studies may indeed indicate that. Did you want to pick up this point, Barbara, about the other threats to journalism and how these things fit together as a whole?
Sure. I mean, I think, first of all, I very much agree in terms of the fact that we have to be very careful in the way we counter the fake news. And you mentioned before the fake news laws, which is not being developed in many countries and is probably much more dangerous to journalism than the fake news phenomenon itself is. The way I see this, we spoke about trust, we spoke about challenges by audiences in understanding what is fact-based news coverage and what is not, or basically both things are being placed on the same level. And this is what I see as being part of a general effort to counter fact-based information, which is the foundation of journalism, but also of many other areas of our life, of scientific information and all of that. And it's part of an effort to censor is not the right word, to silence, if you want, or those independent voices in society that would challenge the leadership. And the role of quality journalism is precisely that. So I think that this contributes to what we call fake news, together with attacks from political leaders against journalists, calling them traitors and so on, which, by the way, is what we had also in more propaganda models. Journalists were defined. Anybody who tried to be an independent journalist was defined as a traitor. The attacks that journalists receive on social media, the direct attacks and all of that, challenging their credibility within their audiences, and then moving on to physical attacks, imprisonment and all of that, is part of the same phenomenon to silence fact-based reporting, which is at the foundation of investigative reporting.
Right. I would agree there and say that I think, for me and in my experience working with many journalists around the world, the fake news catch-all term is an incredibly blunt but also incredibly effective delegitimization tool of the media. It's employed both by the incredibly powerful, from presidents, and I've spoken to some of you in this room who've already given me signs of it. It's a term that has already sunk into the mindset of otherwise intelligent, well-meaning members of the public who now have decreased trusts in levels of journalists. And I think my big challenge is trying to get people to recognize that we should not succumb to what I call lazy fatalism when it comes to journalism, which is don't put us all in the same basket, don't dismiss things, and go out of your way to find out what you can do to distinguish truth from fact. And I think the risk is that fake news is just a catch-all term adopted by everyone to because it takes more money, it takes more time to dig into what might actually be there, truthfully.
I want to come back to Malaysia, because despite this much more murky and complex environment that journalists are now working in, and more physically dangerous environment they're working in, that actually the 1MDB story, I mean, it is a cause for great hope, I feel, because actually, I mean, for those that haven't followed Malaysian politics, it'd be wonderful if you could actually explain what happened from the day that the revelations did break. And they didn't break first in media inside Malaysia, did they? Because they broke, as you said, on the Sarawak blog, Claire Rucastle-Brown, and then in the Washington Post. How did that news then get into Malaysia? And can you just explain what the repercussions have been?
Well, one of the reasons why Sarawak report got a lot of the leaks was because the media in Malaysia was pretty much controlled by the government of the day. So in terms of media ownership, as well as laws, repressive laws that were in place to actually control the media. So a lot of the information were being leaked outside. And so that's why the Wall Street Journal, Sarawak report and all had much more to actually to say. But one of the biggest casualties was also the media. We had a portal that was closed down because they had actually written about charges going to be taken on the Prime Minister in a couple of days. So they had information from inside. Sarawak report was banned. A couple of other portals was also banned. And so the issue of fake news then became something that the government could latch on to as another means of power. So this is my point, actually. I think that in governments that actually operate with secrecy laws, like ours, so we have very strong colonial rule, Official Secrets Act, and so on.
Sorry.
The whole doctrine of fake news suddenly became an added tool. So you have now, on social media, you have cyber troopers on both sides actually spending a lot of time with good information, confusing the people. And so one of the agendas in the lead up to the general election was to call each other's news fake and was to actually prove it with data that what you were saying was actually malicious and what I was saying was actually right, etc., etc. And then the entire objective of confusing the people was met. And then the fake news law was so controversial because who determines what is fake news? In the law, it was the government of the day that would determine what is fake news. So they were actually trying to cover up the entire 1MDB scandal. And the people who were criticizing the issue and trying to get information were then the ones who were going to be targeted to be charged under the fake news. And they had really hefty fines, like 500,000 ringgit, 500,000 ringgit, just for actually publishing and sharing information which was fake. So it was very complicated and very vicious. So people were very confused which one to believe, what to actually believe, and so on. So the only thing were the jurisdictions who were investigating. There were 6 that were investigating, from the FBI, DOJ, Switzerland, Singapore, Luxembourg. The news was coming out from there. So that actually helped balance the information.
And just for those that don't follow Malaysian politics, the repercussions were hundreds of thousands of people on the street coming out to protest, and then, right, initially, and then obviously at the last election. I mean, it's amazing. No?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, I seem more amazed than you. All my Malaysian friends were like literally kind of absolutely astounded. Maria Chin, who runs the Bersai, who was running the Bersai movement, who I think now is a member of parliament, she was sort of saying, you know, even with these revelations, it'll never really sink into the public. We'll never really be heard. And actually, it really was heard. No? Sorry, am I speaking too quickly at you? I'm just saying that actually the fact that in Malaysia those revelations did ultimately lead to a change in the government is something just like really to be celebrated in this moment, because it shows that the truth can cut through and make a political difference.
Yes. So we are now 6 months into the new government. So the government actually got changed, and I think a lot of the battle and the war was actually won, and social media was a very big part of that whole thing. So right now, the parliament has already repealed the anti-fake news law, and there is a promise that information will not be controlled, and that other repressive laws and reforms will be taking place in the coming months. So there's a lot of policy reform and policy change that is being promised, because the government won on an anti-corruption ticket, on a good government ticket. So time will tell whether it really is about genuine reforms or not. And if they get criticized, then whether more laws will actually be put in place to institute controls once again. So at the moment, it's interesting times being in Malaysia because the civil societies are also being engaged in the whole reform and investigative aspects of trying to bring them to justice.
And Mu, you must look, Satchu, you must look at Malaysia and really have hopes for Cambodia.
Malaysia, it took Malaysia 61 years to finally win. Democracy won. And in Cambodia, 35 years. That means we have another 30 years to go. No, that's too far. I want to add something else to what you both said. Accountability and responsibility on fake news. Who started fake news in the first place? Yeah, whether it's a firm that wants to sell something or whatever. Or again, I come back to the Prime Minister. I don't call him my Prime Minister. He's a fake Prime Minister from a fake election. So he has an agenda, right? His agenda is to keep himself in power for the next 35 years. He's only 65 years old, so he can stay for another 30 years. Not Cambodia, it'll be gone. Anyway, so he has the agenda. His agenda is to stay in power. The tactic with it is to conquer, to control, and to divide, and to break, to oppress, so he can stay in power. So I would say, he's the guy who should be guilty. He is guilty, yeah? So you're saying, but when we see fake news, we have to be able to check whether it's fake news or not. I have a master's degree, a PhD or whatever. I can check, I can go, I can Google, I can go whatever, to wherever. Excuse me, but are farmers who lost their land, are factory workers who make less than $2 a day, do they have time to check whether it is fake news or not? No. So that's why I, again, say that I totally respect, admire the journalists, activists, human rights defenders who go out there and take the bullets, literally take the bullet, to come up with real news, to cover real news. That's why we have to band together and find and bring strategies together to see how we overcome, how we should be shaping our society, our news, rather than letting dictators shape our society.
So let's take on your challenge. I feel like we've already covered the ground that the way to do that, the way to help citizens understand what is fake and to hear, and to even have the chance to receive news that is true and accurate, that banning fake news and passing fake news laws is never going to be the answer, because it will be so easily, manipulated and used. And I think Kenya have also passed a fake news law, which will be used in exactly the same way to actually suppress journalism. So we're not looking to ban it. So what suggestions and thoughts do the panel have on that? And Will, I know that ICIJ's model is possibly part of that solution. Do you want to sort of speak to your collaborative model?
That's right. ICIJ, in many ways, was born out of the recognition or realization that traditional models of investigative journalism have collapsed, that newsrooms en masse around the world, even if they had an investigative journalism section, either no longer exists or is significantly reduced. And the ICIJ model was a simple one, which was strength in numbers and safety in numbers. That is, if journalists increasingly find it difficult to have the financial resources, to have the time to commit 1 week, 1 month, 1 year to an investigation, then working together with journalists within their country or in different countries provides an opportunity to increase impact and to show that journalism still matters and can make a change. And that is very much the model of Panama Papers. I think most of us in this room are probably realistic enough to agree that stories of corruption happen in many of our countries every day, certainly every week. And we're at a point where those stories can be a drop in the ocean. In order to overcome that phenomenon, instead of having one journalist report on a corruption story, if you can amplify that by 400 and have 400 journalists collaborate and publish on the same day, at the same time, with the local knowledge that each of those journalists bring to their specific case, then that's a potential inroad to greater impact and greater public trust in journalists. And I think we've seen sparks of that. There will always be those people, like the Minister of Justice in Cambodia, who says Panama Papers is fake news, my name's not there. But I do like to think, and I've heard from enough members of government, members of society, and just the average man and woman on the street, that something like Panama Papers did help raise awareness, put pressure on, and offer an insight into how journalism can be done in a new age.
Brilliant, thank you. Other thoughts from the panel?
So I'm going to agree with the general sentiment, which I believe is that the antidote to this disease, if it's a disease, is actually professional journalism. We need more of it, and we need it to be on scale, and we need people to be able to access it. So for me, there are kind of three interlocking problems. And these actually come back to the panel this morning where Kumi was talking about structural issues around media. The first one, I think, is around ownership and co-option of media. And there it's both state and the use of public advertising budgets to influence editorial lines, but also the increasing process of ownership where it is becoming a close proximity to government. I think the second one is that we have to recognize that funding for this is dissipated, and that the tech giants, through the advertising markets, which Chris actually touched on tangentially, because when he's describing the use of data and his agreement with the use of consent in data, he's describing an advertising ecosystem that has existed for 10 years. Its application to political issues is the problem. But sorry, that's a deviation. So it's around income and finding money to pay. And I think the third thing is around what are we going to do about social media and social media content? And I think there's a real strong argument for the need for the creation of independent self-regulatory councils, maybe built on print media council models that can both allow social media companies to have or retain their intermediary liability, to step back from direct pressure from governments, but also from civil society, but also allow individuals to have access to remedies, and also governments access to remedies as well. So I think those are the three pillars I would focus on.
Yeah, and I'm happy that you brought up that last piece, because I feel like the model of news that we currently have, where, as you say, you can analyze a website that people go to for news, is going to be challenged as we move forward. And actually, there is no website. There's only the news that's been targeted to us and is arriving in our feed. And without regulation and transparency, there won't be a repository of anywhere you can go to see what news other people have been reading, and won't have the opportunity to kind of challenge the accuracy of that news, because I can see news in the way that it's going to be disseminated, fragmenting onto a kind of personal level.
But again, I'm going to quote research from Reuters Institute. They've last year in their global summary, sorry, I forget the precise name of the report. Sorry? Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Digital
Monique.
News Report. So they talked about the fact that echo chambers and filter bubbles were actually reducing, not increasing. And actually, social media and access through digital tools and access on the phone and access, was actually creating more visibility and more findability of more content, although there was a subsection of people who were actually focusing more and more in on single types of content. But arguably, that's always been the case. So it's interesting. We're in an interesting time.
No, it's just the case that obviously if you want to go back and see what was, on the front page of the Times on a certain date in history, you can go and look at that, and you can go and see that and say, oh, they did cover that, and they covered it on page 8. I'm just sort of speaking to the need for regulation, which will mean that there is the transparency that you can go back when you want to and say, actually, what was that news entity serving to people on that day? Because it will be something much more fragmented, and therefore it's much harder to challenge, stories that are out there if you don't even know that they were out there, or who read them. But thoughts from others? Barbara?
Sure. I think that addition to what Will was talking about from the news community, the cooperative aspect is very, very important, and ICHJ has been fantastic in that, but is expanding also to other areas beyond investigative journalism, so that's very important. What we have noticed also within the community of quality news organizations is the efforts to, like thinking about how can we rebuild the trust. And the way you rebuild the trust is by creating, first of all, communicating to your audience the way you do your work. Why can you, reader, listener, and believe that what I'm telling you is true? This is my research methodology. This is how I achieve this, I reach this information, this conclusion, and so on. So creating the community, explaining how journalism works, how quality investigative journalism works, has also become a very important aspect of journalistic activities themselves. And on the other hand, I do want to see a positive aspect of, today there are a lot of civil society organizations also working with the platforms to try and identify ways in which the platforms, which, let's not forget, I mean, Facebook, and many of the platforms have been behind the Arab Spring, has been remain very important channels of distribution of independent information in realities where that is not possible otherwise. So let's not forget that part. So, but the platforms have been working also with civil society organizations to try and understand how can they fulfill that role better. And we can criticize their business-based model, all of that, but I do want to believe that we are trying to go in a direction that is improving the system.
Optimism. Do you have a comment on how you think things can be improved? Or should we throw it to the floor?
Yes. Yes, we do. One of the things actually in the recommendations for this plenary is really how the Panama Papers exploded and got a whole lot of governments reeling as a result of that, including some prime ministers and presidents resigning because they were just caught with their pants down. So the need for investigative journalism is so important in the era of fake news. And it is so important that this gets stepped up, because one of the lessons that we learned from 1MDB was that nothing stays within the confines of the country. Things are moving cross-border, money is moving cross-border, power is being shared and exchanged between Arab countries and Malaysia, between offshore islands that have actually helped to hide the wealth and so on. So what is it that we need as investigators, anti-corruption advocates, to actually build on the expose so that we can counter this fake news propaganda thing? Because it was actually propaganda. It was Donald Trump that created this whole fake news thing. But how do we enhance and refine, help investigative journalism shine so that this is the way to actually counter fake news, and this is the way to knock impunity, which is the second part of the title of this plenary, that information is so powerful that it can actually change governments, as in the case of Malaysia. Of course, it wasn't just the 1MDB. There were other corruption scandals as well that implicated the prime minister. But everything had to do with someone exposing it. And most of the time, it was people from inside. Insiders that were leaking information because there wasn't proper channels. So Facebook, Twitter, everything became very useful for people to actually share information and data. But my question is, what can we do concretely now to actually enhance this whole work of investigative journalism? For without the Wall Street Journal and Sarawak Report, Najib would still be in power, because we would not have known, Malaysian people would not have known and could not exercise their rights at the ballot box. And in the case of Cambodia and many other governments that are still in power, I think it is about scaling the information network so that they can be brought down. So I think the question is for all of us to really answer. So this thing about charging them with predicate offenses under money laundering and all that isn't really how a corruption scandal can be overcome.
Well, you've all been charged with answering this question. Do we have a mic roving around in the room? Otherwise, I can lend you mine, sir.
Thank you. My name is Shakil Shabir. I'm a member of Parliament for Kenya and the chair of APNAC, the African Parliamentarians Against Corruption. That's part of the GOPAC. I want to tell you, madam, there were 3 of us who stopped the Prime Minister of Malaysia in 2015 from opening that conference. Just 3 of us, including the founder of TI. Well, I think there were 4. We started that. So what you must do is these type of conferences, that is a plus. This is how we can do it here. We can actually sit here and let's not just make statements, let's do something about it. The second thing I want to address you, my brother. I beg your pardon. I am sorry.
I'm gender non-conforming, so you can't get it wrong, really.
All right, then. In that case, thank you very much, and we appreciate you for what you are. Kenya, and I speak for Kenya as a member of parliament, now for the 3rd term, and I would say this. We have, and I was the one who pushed the Freedom of Information and Access to Information Bill, and yes, we have a bill for false reporting. But we are saying that if a reporter says something is wrong and he did it purposefully, he will be prosecuted. That doesn't mean that we are banning or we are in any way holding back an investigative reporter. We are saying that if you come up with false news, if you say Shakil went and did this, A, B, and C, we shall hold you responsible, whether you do it on the press, or whether you do it on the Facebook, or whether you do it on the WhatsApp. That is not the same as the fake news that you're talking about. So please note that as far as Kenya is concerned, we're one of the most open with reporters. You have not seen reporters in any problem. And I apologize for...
No apology necessary.
Thank you, ma'am.
So, thank you. I take it that you voted to support that legislation, and I want to get a reaction from the panel. Is it different to say that we're prosecuting reporters when they're knowingly doing fake news? Is that really different from...
So, I think this is very dangerous. I am talking about Cambodia again, or in a government that is very oppressive. Where's the line? Who defines what? You know, and how is a journalist who is really working, putting his life out there, defend himself against a machinery of a government? And I want to add also that these excellent journalists who are doing investigative journalism should be protected fully. Their family members as well. Yeah, and most of them work without any, sometimes no salary, you know, and thinking about the safety of their families and then having to go into exile. So I think that, again, we have to be in a world, in a society where we respect the fundamental human rights of receiving information and providing information.
Thank you.
Can I quickly agree with that?
You can very quickly agree, yes, and the room can agree.
It's a very dangerous precedent to set because there are existing international standards, particularly including around defamation, which obviously needs to be targeted at an individual rather than just the truth. And if you include into international standards now this idea of truth and falsehood, it opens up a huge new vista to prosecute journalists. And technically, under that standard, actually there's nothing, here I'm going for a freedom of expression absolutist position, but there's nothing against lying. You know, lying is not a crime. And if you create it and make it a crime, it's you know, journalists are going to go to jail. They're going to be prosecuted for abuse of, you know, truth, which which is so open to interpretation.
Thank you. I'm going to take another comment or question from the audience. Will you tell us who you are, sir?
Yes, I am Al-Akri from Bahrain. Of course, now there is more information available to ordinary people through the electronic media and so on, the flow of media. But we have two things to it. My question is, how to turn this information to mobilize people to turn it into action? Because it's not enough that you have the information. And we have exceptions that change, for example, in Malaysia, but this is not a holistic change. The second is that in many of Middle East countries, okay, you can receive information, you can receive, but you are fraud. But there are laws, there are actions, there are procedures that will label opinion and even receiving news or retweeting as abuse against the state, that you are slandering the state or you are casting doubts about so-and-so, or you are, and these are penalized. So that's why people receive information, a lot of this, but don't use it for, or don't put opinion on that. And the third thing is, no, just what you call, say, the electronic flies, electronic flies, is that hundreds of thousands of fake accounts. There are now companies used by the states in order to propagate certain news that will create that will counter the facts.
Thank you. Who wants to grab a bit of that?
I'll respond to a few of those things. Around questions of impact, that is something that investigative journalists are increasingly aware of. At a time when fewer people are paying for investigative journalism, we know that every dollar we receive needs to be visible somehow, materialized, so that we can keep doing our work. And journalists are increasingly creative around that. We have regional collaborations like Sonozo in West Africa that's helping to draw attention to regions through collaborations. We have the Organised Crime and Corruption Reporting Project that's working with, in some ways, civil society to improve impact so that journalists' work can be accompanied by real action. I don't want, and I don't think anyone on this panel would want the impression to be given that somehow journalists are the David Beckham of the written text world or television world. Like, we can't do everything alone, and there's nothing more frustrating than an investigation that dies as soon as it's published, right? So civil society, members of the public need to help with that. And I would also say on that same point, we live in a world of Tinder. You swipe left, you swipe right, you move on. Journalism requires more engagement than that. We have to avoid the Tinderization of news, which means that, yes, Panama Papers came out on one day and you might have heard about it for a few days. But just because you're still not hearing about it doesn't mean that good journalists, that good government officials are not still digging away, trying to bring to light and trying to make sure that some of that truth continues to be heard and acted upon.
Thank you. I'm not going to rob you of your applause. I've got a question here.
My name is Bisi Alimi, and I think one of the conversations that we're having now is actually what played out between Monique and Rumi this morning about how divided we've all become. And I think it's very important, something that Chris said when he was asked in that video, that can we believe you? And it's a fundamental question that we have to put to journalists, that can we really trust you? Every day we're bombarded with news, even from trusted outlets, that a lot of time you question, the amount of truth that is in it. And it pains me that we now live in a world where we have to doubt a journalist. It is and we can talk about this and think, oh, it's something that is just a little problem. It's a dangerous thing that a lot of us cannot even open a news outlet and spend 3, 5, 7 minutes reading a news article and believe that we can trust what we are reading. And I practically don't know what the answer is, but I think there is a need for an inward looking from journalists to actually say that we really need collaboratively redirect the approach that we have to news. And I just felt this is a very difficult and dangerous time that we are in, and we need solution as fast as possible.
Thank you. I feel like that was more of a comment than a question, but Barbara, if you want to jump in.
No, I just wanted to...
I'm going over here.
I think that the sentiment that you have expressed is exactly the core point we started from, which is we have created societies in which people cannot trust anybody and anything anymore, and that is the most challenging aspect because it makes people very insecure. I do think that there are different elements that contributed to that. What we have seen in the film is one, what some of our political leaders, the ideas and the type of rhetorics that they have been expressing is another. However, I don't want to believe that journalism is to blame for that. I don't want to believe that the feeling of distrust originates from the fact that today we have less quality journalism than we used to have. There has always been quality journalism, or there's been less quality one, so yeah.
We're out of time, but I want to take this last comment from the audience, and then I'll come back very quickly to the panel.
Okay, thank you. My name is Kabrab. I am from Ethiopia, Transparency Ethiopia, and I wanted to raise my concern about fake news and legislations. So I believe that civil society and the media need to have more space, but on the other hand, governments do have a role in protecting peace and security of their respective nations. So in my country, currently, there are more than 1.5 million people displaced because of different ethnic conflicts. And among that, the major contributor of this is a fake news. So if we are going to say that fake news should not be regulated by a government, don't you think that it's going to be limiting the role of a government in protecting peace and security in a country? So I think we don't need to easily look at the impact of fake news, because many people are becoming victims, especially in my country. Thank you.
Thank you. I think with the nature of that comment, we will give the last word of this panel. That's right, to you, Sochi. It's you. Go on.
My reaction to this, I'm really sorry. On this issue of regulation, what's the role of the government in regulation of the media? And if you talk about, if you want to give the government a role and give the government an excuse which is control, making sure that our land is secure, that the national security is enforced, I am, as far as the government or my country is concerned, I am a rebel. Because, why? Because I am a traitor. Why? Because I defend human rights and freedom of expression. I was put in jail and for the excuse of the government, and I am a member of parliament. I was put in jail without my immunity lifted off. And what did Musako do? She endangered national security. And today, everything is about national security. If you want to get rid of somebody who is a critic, national security. So this is very, very dangerous. I'm sorry, I disagree.
But we do agree that government should take responsibility in ensuring the safety of journalists and investigating where journalists have not been safe.
Not just safety, and demanding independent investigation when a journalist is murdered.
Good.
Or put in jail.
I think what needs to be recognized is that the existing international standards, whether it be on incitement to violence or defamation or even on national security, they've been developed over 50 years. They're good. They apply to the online world as well. They need to be applied. What we need to stop doing is inventing new things because it's suddenly digital and we all panic. So new digital defamation or digital national security or new standards for whistleblowers online. All these things are just creating more and more pressure. And I couldn't agree more The last group in any country in the world that I want to regulate the type of media that I consume is the government. It is the least capable of doing it. It is absolutely counter-logical that you would want the government to decide what a population reads.
We're over time. We could talk about this all day. We will be talking about this all day, I'm sure. But please give my panel a massive round of applause. And before you go, I just want to I can see you want to say something else, but I'm not going to let you.
Today is the 27th anniversary of the Paris Peace Accord in Cambodia, and I ask you to welcome,
Celebrate
with us and ask your government that are signatories to the Paris Accord in Cambodia to comply with their obligations, which is the protection of human rights and democracy and free and fair elections in Cambodia.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hurrah. I'm just going to point out, we have 4 more films still playing in the film program. 1,000 Girls Like Me is at 4:30 today. It's an Afghani film. The director and the amazing film subject to hear. It's about one woman's struggle for justice in the system there after sexual abuse. I think it's an amazing film. Please come and see it at 4:30. And then later this evening, we have The Trial of Ratko Mladic, a film 5 years in the making. This is actually the sneak preview. The filmmakers are here, the lawyers are here who worked on that case, and Sarah Chase, that you heard in the previous plenary, is doing that Q&A. Then tomorrow, Strike a Rock from South Africa. We have MP Primrose Sonti, who's one of the women of the Marikana movement. She'll be with the filmmaker of that film. And then the final film tomorrow is The Silence of Others, which is about the victims of Franco in Spain, battling to overturn the law of forgiveness in the Argentinian courts using universal jurisdiction. And again, the director of the film is here, along with one of the film subjects. And that film won the Audience Award at the Berlin Film Festival. So as you leave, we're just going to play the trailer for all the films that are playing in the film program. And thank you all for coming. Have a wonderful rest of conference.
كان في مشاركة مع كثير من القوى اللي كانت بإسرائيل إنها ضد الاحتلال.
רצינו לעורר זעקה בקרב נשים. תראו מה קורה לנשים כאישה לאישה.
Once you start getting arrested, it goes in your record. They're taking away jobs that they could be future lawyers, future cops.
Supervisors that are using police officers as a revenue-producing agent for the city. This system has to change.
World Bank has provided billions of dollars budget support to the Ethiopian government.
بچم این محبت است البته کار میکنه
قاضی فکر میکنه من دروغ میگفتم باید آن وقت ثبوت داشته بردوش از بین میبرد میتقصیشم نمیشد.
This was the weapon that Steve Bannon wanted to build to fight his culture war. The company itself was founded on using Facebook data. If you want to fundamentally change society, you first have to break it.
Aba bafazi insana zabangazange bazozondla ngantoni na nina ndiyadla nikhophi bottle saze ndiwithdraw never.
I don't want to forget them and I don't want them to forget me.